My children left me to die in the hospital with the bills. But my husband's inheritance saved, and I taught them a lesson. I am Adana, born in 1958, in the busy heart of Enugu, Nigeria. Back in 2005, when my husband collapsed unexpectedly from a heart attack, I thought the world had ended for me. I felt like the ground had been ripped from under my feet. But then something happened. I discovered I had to live not just for myself, but for our 3 children. Today, at 67, sitting in a quiet room where the light falls gently through the curtains, I am finally sharing this because someone out there might be in a season where family feels distant and love feels conditional. If you're listening, drop your location below, and if this story touches you, please like and subscribe. The smell of antiseptic in the hospital room clung to my nostrils, as though it wanted to remind me of my fragility. I lay on the thin mattress, the beeping of machines keeping me company more faithfully than my children did. I had raised 3 vibrant, intelligent adults, one a lawyer, another a banker, and the last a medical doctor. People envied me in the neighborhood, saying I was blessed, saying I would never lack in my old age. But that was before my illness, before I saw the truth of their heart. The day the doctor pulled up a chair and told me I would need a complicated surgery and months of medication afterward, I tried to stay brave. He explained the bills slowly, as though careful not to break me in half. I nodded, pretending I was listening. But in my head, all I heard was a loud silence. When he finished, I managed to ask, "So how much, altogether?" His eyes softened. "It will be close to 4 million naira, ma'am. Without it, your body might not recover fully." 4 million. It sounded like the sky was collapsing. I remembered the small savings I had left after years of raising children alone, paying school fees, skipping new clothes so they could shine. My bank balance was like a dry well, barely enough for a bucket of water, not enough to irrigate a farm. So I turned to the people I thought would stand by me. First was my eldest, Ifeanyi. He visited with his well-polished shoes and briefcase, sitting beside me like a client, not a son. "Mama, things are hard," he began, sighing loudly so I would hear his struggle. "You know the economy. The firm hasn't paid in weeks." I wanted to believe him, but I had seen him weeks before, showing off his new car to neighbors. I swallowed my pain. "Just a little support. My son, I need the surgery." He patted my hand as though dismissing a child. "Maybe ask the other. You know I have children of my own now." Then came my daughter, Chioma, my second. She swept into the ward in her expensive perfume, her nails painted crimson, phone glued to her ear. She barely sat down before telling me about her trip to Dubai for a conference. I listened patiently, waiting for her to ask about me. When I finally spoke, my voice cracked. "Chioma, the bills. The doctor says it's urgent." She looked uncomfortable, as though I had interrupted her script. "Mama, you should have prepared better. We all told you to invest years ago. I can't keep dipping into my account. I've worked too hard for what I have." Her words stung sharper than the IV needles. Prepared better? I had prepared their futures with the marrow of my bones. I gave her silence because my tears were too heavy to explain themselves. My last-born, Keleki, the doctor, was my final hope. If anyone understood the weight of illness, surely it would be him. He arrived with his white coat draped over his arm, looking every inch the successful young man. I told him gently, "My son, your siblings, they say they cannot help, but you understand." He cleared his throat, looked away. "Mama, even doctors struggle. The hospital hasn't increased my salary. Besides, it would not be fair if I carry everything on my head. You should ask the church for help." As if strangers owed me more than the children I had labored for. I smiled faintly at him, because the alternative was to collapse in grief. So the days turned to weeks. My health declined, but the visits from my children grew shorter, cold. The bills piled up like bricks, and the nurses grew impatient, when payments delayed. I began to feel less like a mother and more like an abandoned burden. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, hearing its blades whir like a reminder that life goes on, with or without compassion. One evening, a kind nurse whispered to me as she adjusted my drip, "Mama, you look like someone carrying a storm. Do you have no one to help?" I shook my head. I raised 3 children. I thought that would be enough. It's okay to feel hurt, but sometimes blessings come from places we don't expect. Her words became a small candle in my darkness. I thought back to my husband, Chike, whose laughter used to fill our home like music. He had always been prudent, always careful. Before his death, he would sometimes say, "Adana, if anything happens to me, remember, not everything I have is visible." I had brushed it off as one of his cryptic jokes, but as I lay in that hospital bed, his words began to echo differently. My body was weak, but my mind grew restless. I remembered an old brown envelope he had once tucked into the lining of his wooden wardrobe. At the time, I had assumed it was just documents. Could it be more? But I shook the thought away, because my reality was sharper than memory. I was in a hospital, with unpaid bills, and no way out. Still, the more my children withdrew, the more my heart hardened into something that surprised even me. The woman who once bent over backwards for family began to feel an iron rod in her spine. If I survived this storm, I told myself, something in our story would change forever. The night the rain hammered against the hospital windows, I lay awake listening to the water pound like 1,000 fists on the glass. My children had not visited in days. The nurses walked past my door, whispering about overdue bills, their eyes flicking toward me with pity. I felt small, almost invisible, as though I was already fading into the shadows of the ward. Yet inside me, a stubborn ember refused to die. I kept remembering my husband's words. Not everything I have is visible. One morning, as the doctor repeated his concerns about delayed payments, I made a decision. I asked the nurse for my handbag, the faded leather one I had clutched, even when being wheeled into the emergency room. With trembling hands, I searched through its inner pockets until I found the tiny brass key my husband had given me. 20 years earlier, I had forgotten it was even there. He had whispered then, "For when the world turns its back on you." Okoro, who had been my husband's confidant, his voice was still deep and steady, like the ground beneath a strong tree. "Adana, you sound weak. What is happening?" "Okoro," I said, swallowing my pride. "Chike once gave me a key. He spoke of something hidden. Do you know anything about it?" There was a long silence. Then he said, "Ah, so you have finally asked." "Yes, your husband was wise. He opened a private account, only for you. He told me never to reveal it unless you sought it yourself. The bank is Fidelity, under your name. Adana, you are not as poor as you think." My heart jolted. I felt as though someone had lifted a boulder off my chest. After arranging for him to bring me the necessary documents, the picture became clear. My husband had left me a hidden inheritance. Millions carefully saved, investments tucked away in a quiet account that no one, not even our children, knew about. The first time I saw the account balance on the paper Okoro handed me, I nearly wept. It was more than enough to cover my treatment, my recovery, and a new life. My husband had left me a gift, wrapped in foresight. I whispered into the hospital air, "Chike, you did not forget me." The next few weeks transformed me. With that inheritance, I paid for the surgery. The doctors moved quickly, and though the recovery was painful, I clung to life with a renewed purpose. As I lay in bed after the operation, watching the ceiling fan spin slowly, I no longer felt abandoned. I felt like a woman reborn, armed with a secret my children could not steal. When the nurse brought me discharge papers, I signed them quietly, without informing my children. They had stopped calling altogether. except for the occasional polite text message. "Hope you're better, Mama." They never asked how the bills were settled. Perhaps they assumed some charity had intervened. I did not correct them. Instead, I walked out of that hospital one morning, my steps shaky but determined, breathing in the fresh air of freedom. I went back to the house my husband built, the one filled with his memories. The wardrobe still stood where he had left it, and in its lining I found the brown envelope. Inside were letters he had written to me, filled with gentle reminders of who I was, strong, capable, worthy of dignity. He had written, "Adana, if our children ever forget what it means to love, let this remind you that your worth is not tied to their gratitude." With the inheritance, I hired a financial advisor, a young woman named Amara, who spoke with sharp clarity. I told her I wanted to use the money, not for luxury, but for legacy. "I want to build something," I explained, "something that will outlive me, something my children cannot corrupt." Together we mapped out a foundation, one dedicated to widows, orphans, and the abandoned elderly, people like me, who had been cast aside when they needed love most. I poured my energy into it, attending meetings, signing documents, meeting volunteers. Slowly a vision unfolded, a grand estate where people could find shelter, education, and care. Every brick laid on that estate felt like a piece of my healing. I would walk among the workers, greeting them with small jokes, laughing when the cement splashed my wrap. One day, a young orphan tugged at my sleeve and said, "Mama, why are you always smiling?" I knelt down, brushing the dust from his cheek. "Because I have known sadness, my child. And when you've tasted sadness, every bit of joy feels sweet." In those moments, I realized something important. I was no longer building just for myself. I was building a weapon of love, a lesson wrapped not in anger but in undeniable truth. My children, who thought I was powerless, would one day stand before this legacy and see how wrong they were. Months passed and the estate neared completion. The foundation launched quietly, with no fanfare, no announcement to my children. I remained silent in their world, almost ghost-like, replying to their rare messages with short, polite answers. They never asked to visit, and I never offered. They believed me to be fading in obscurity. Meanwhile, I was rising in strength. The day the lawyers finalized the estate documents, I made sure my children's names were absent, not out of spite, but out of justice. They had abandoned me in my hour of need. I would not hand them the fruits of my husband's sacrifice. Instead, I redirected everything toward the foundation. My life had turned a corner, and the road ahead glittered with purpose. The lesson was almost ready. The invitations were sent on crisp white paper, sealed with a golden crest bearing my husband's initial. They were addressed to my children, each letter delivered to their offices with formal precision. "You are invited to the unveiling and estate gathering of Mrs. Adana, to be held at the family property." The wording was deliberate, carefully chosen to ignite curiosity. For months they had barely remembered me. Now suddenly, they rushed to rearrange their schedules, whispering among themselves, wondering which of them would inherit the property they had silently counted on. I arrived at the estate hours before they did, walking through the polished halls that smelled of fresh paint and jasmine. Volunteers from the foundation had decorated the place with banners reading, "Love Restores." Children in neatly pressed uniforms rehearsed songs in the courtyard, their voices rising like hope itself. I stood quietly in the center of it all, my heart steady. The lesson was not for me, it was for them. The first to arrive was Ifanyai, my eldest, his tie knotted perfectly, eyes scanning the driveway as though he was already calculating property value. Behind him, Chioma stepped out of her car, her heels clicking on the stones, perfume trailing behind her. Kileshi came last, rushing, carrying himself with the air of someone forced into duty. None of them noticed the children singing in the background. None of them asked about the banners. Their eyes searched only for documents, titles, and signatures. When they entered the main hall, they froze. Instead of dusty furniture and forgotten relics, they saw a grand gathering. Guests from the community, lawyers, widows who had already benefited from the foundation, and orphans seated neatly in the front row. The room buzzed with warmth, but their faces twisted in confusion. Chioma gasped, her voice echoing louder than she intended. I stepped forward slowly, dressed in a flowing white gown that shimmered under the lights, healthier and stronger than they had ever expected to see me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My children stared at me, as though I had risen from the grave. Mama, but how? Kileshi stuttered, his eyes darting to the lawyer standing beside me. I let the silence stretch, allowing their discomfort to grow heavy in the air. Then I spoke softly, so every ear could hear. Yes, it is me, the mother you left in a hospital bed, the woman you decided was too costly to save. Their faces paled. Ifaniai opened his mouth, then closed it again, like a fish gasping on dry land. Chioma shifted uncomfortably, her nails tapping against her phone. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading aloud. Today, we unveil the Adana Foundation, established by Mrs. Adana, in honor of her late husband. This estate, along with significant financial resources, will serve widows, orphans, and the elderly abandoned by their family. A murmur spread through the hall. My children exchanged quick, panicked glances. They had expected a will, a division of property. Instead, they were hearing their disinheritance, dressed in the language of legacy. I turned to the crowd, not to my children, and spoke from the depths of my soul. When I was sick, I discovered that love cannot be measured in titles or bank accounts. I raised children with my whole heart, but when I needed them, they chose themselves. So I decided this inheritance, my husband's gift, would not die of selfishness. It would live in compassion. A widow in the front row wept softly. The children sang a gentle chorus that filled the silence. Still, my own children stood frozen, their eyes fixed on me, with disbelief and shame. Chioma finally broke the silence. Mama, this isn't fair. We are your blood. You can't just... I raised my hand, stopping her words like a barrier. Blood without love is only water. You abandoned me when I begged for help. Do you think inheritance is only for those who share my name? No, inheritance belongs to those who understand compassion. I tried a different approach, stepping closer, his voice softer. Mama, please, we didn't know you had money. We thought the money was never the test. Love was. The room fell silent again. The lawyer continued, by legal declaration, all 3 children are disinherited. The estate and all accounts have been transferred to the Adana Foundation, secured against private claims. A collective gasp echoed. My children's faces collapsed into a mixture of anger, disbelief, and shame. They looked around, perhaps hoping for sympathy from the guests, but none came. The people in that hall had seen the truth. A mother once abandoned, now restored and strong. I felt no rage as I watched them squirm, only clarity. This was not vengeance. It was a mirror. I wanted them to see what they had become, and perhaps, one day, choose differently. The ceremony continued. The children sang. Widows gave testimonies, and the foundation was launched with applause and celebration. My children remained silent in the corner, shadows against the light of joy. For once, they were the outsiders in a story they thought they controlled. As the event ended, I walked past them without lingering. Chioma reached out, her hand brushing mine. Her eyes pleaded silently. I paused, looked at her, and said gently, "It is not too late to learn love, but you must start with yourselves."
not my wealth. And then I walked on, out into the courtyard, where the children's laughter filled the air, where widows held my hands with gratitude, where life pulsed with meaning. The estate no longer felt like a house of memories. It was now a living sanctuary. That night, as the stars stretched wide over the estate, I stood by the balcony and breathed deeply. I thought of my husband, smiling somewhere beyond the veil, proud that his inheritance had become a lesson carved into stone. My children will never forget what they witnessed today. Neither would I. Moral lesson: love cannot be purchased, demanded, or borrowed. It must be practiced in the daily choices we make for one another. When family turns away, it wounds deeply, yet even those wounds can be transformed into strength. My journey taught me that silence can be louder than anger, and compassion can outlast betrayal. If you are listening, remember this: wealth is fleeting, but kindness is eternal. Build legacies that lift others, even when those closest to you fail. And if love feels lost in your home, don't despair, you've got this. Sometimes family is chosen through compassion, not